The coffee had gone cold 3 hours ago, but Agent Marco Benedetti kept sipping it anyway. The bitter taste helped him focus on the photographs spread across his desk. Each image showed the same thing: empty graves in the cemetery outside Prague, all dug from the inside out. Benedetti. Cardinal Toretti's voice cut through the silence of the archive chamber. Your flight leaves in 2 hours. Marco looked up from the photos. The cardinal stood in the doorway, his red robes looking almost black in the dim lighting of the underground facility. Behind him, the endless rows of filing cabinets stretched into the distance, each one containing reports that the world above would never see. Prague again? Marco asked, already knowing the answer. The situation has developed. Toretti stepped into the room and placed a manila folder on the desk. 3 more graves. The local authorities are calling it vandalism, but we know better. Marco opened the folder. The new photographs were worse than the first batch. The earth around each grave site had been pushed up in perfect circles, as if something large had emerged from below. But it was the other photos that made him set down his coffee cup. Witnesses this time, he said. A groundskeeper named Pavel Novak. He was doing his evening rounds when he saw them climbing out. Toretti's voice remained steady. He's been sedated and moved to a secure facility in Rome. The local bishop has been told he suffered a breakdown. Marco studied the witness statement. Pavel's words had been transcribed in neat Italian script, but the original check notes were attached. Even through the translation, the terror came through clearly. He says they looked like people he knew, Marco read aloud. His brother who died 5 years ago, his childhood friend, his first wife. All of them were buried in that cemetery, Toretti confirmed. All of them came out of their graves 2 nights ago. All of them spoke to him. What did they say? They invited him to come home with them. Marco closed the folder and reached for his travel bag, which was always packed and ready. In his 3 years working for the Black Archive, he had learned that time was usually the difference between containing a situation and letting it spread beyond their control. The rules, he said, not making it a question. Toretti nodded and pulled out a small card. Standard protocol for resurrections. 5 rules, no exceptions. Marco took the card and read the familiar text. 1. Never go alone. Minimum team of 2 agents 2. Carry blessed water and silver at all times 3. Do not touch anything that has been underground 4. If someone calls your name 3 times, leave immediately 5. All bodies must be blessed and reburied before dawn. Who's my partner? Marco asked, tucking the card into his jacket pocket. Agent Sofia Martinelli. She's waiting at the airport. Marco had worked with Sofia twice before. She was reliable, thorough, and most importantly, she followed the rules without question. In their line of work, creative thinking could get you killed. What about backup? Local Bishop Kohler will provide assistance, but he doesn't know the full situation. As far as he's concerned, you're investigating reports of grave desecration for insurance purposes. Marco shouldered his bag and headed for the door. And if this spreads beyond the cemetery, then we'll have bigger problems than explaining missing bodies to the Prague police. The elevator ride to the surface took 2 minutes. 2 minutes to transition from the world below, where filing cabinets held reports of miracles and curses, to the world above, where people complained about traffic and worried about their jobs. Marco had made this transition hundreds of times, but it never got easier. Rome's afternoon sun hit him like a physical force as he stepped out of the nondescript building that served as the archive's entrance. To anyone passing by, it looked like another government office building. The brass nameplate beside the door read, Historical Documentation Services, in 3 languages. The taxi ride to the airport gave him time to review the case file more thoroughly. The first graves had been discovered 4 days ago. Empty holes in the ground, with soil scattered around them in patterns that suggested rapid excavation from below. The cemetery caretaker had assumed vandals were responsible and had called the local police. But when the police investigated, they found something that made them contact the church immediately. Each grave contained personal items that should have been buried with the deceased. Wedding rings, rosaries, photographs. All of them were arranged on the headstones above the empty graves, as if placed there carefully by hand. The groundskeeper, Pavel, had been working at the cemetery for 15 years. According to his statement, he knew the burial locations of every person interred there. He could recite their names, their dates of death, even details about their funeral services. When he saw the figures climbing out of the graves, he recognized each one. His brother Dominic, who had died in a car accident 5 years earlier. His childhood friend Thomas, who had succumbed to cancer the previous winter. His first wife, Elena, who had passed away during childbirth 20 years ago. All of them exactly as he remembered them, but with soil in their hair and cemetery dirt under their fingernails. Marco read Pavel's description of the encounter. They were happy to see me. Elena smiled the way she used to when I came home from work. Dominic waved and called out my name like we were meeting for lunch. They said they had been waiting for me to visit, and now I could come with them back to where they were staying. Where were they staying? The interviewer had asked. Under the ground, in the warm place. They said there were others there, and everyone was very peaceful. They said the rules were different down there, and I wouldn't have to worry about being tired or sad anymore. That's when Pavel had run. He had sprinted from the cemetery to the nearest police station, babbling about dead people walking around and inviting him to join them underground. The officer on duty had initially dismissed him as drunk, but Pavel's terror had been too genuine to ignore. By the time the police returned to the cemetery with Pavel, the figures were gone. But 3 more graves had been opened from the inside, and more personal belongings had been arranged on the headstones. The plane to Prague was half empty, which suited Marco fine. He used the flight time to study maps of the cemetery and the surrounding area. The burial ground was old, dating back to the 14th century, but most of the current graves were from the past 50 years. It served 3 parishes in the district, and the record-keeping was meticulous. Sophia was waiting for him at the Prague airport baggage claim. She was tall and athletic, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her expression was serious as always, but Marco caught the slight tension around her eyes that meant she was worried about this assignment. "Any new developments?" he asked as they walked toward the rental car desk. 2 more witnesses came forward this morning, she said. Both groundskeepers from different shifts. Both report seeing people they knew climbing out of graves. Same cemetery? Same cemetery, but the pattern is expanding. The first witnesses saw 3 figures, the second witness saw 5, the third witness saw 8. Marco signed the rental paperwork and accepted the keys. All people they recognized? All people who were buried in that cemetery, some going back decades. Sophia consulted her notes. But here's the strange part. They're not appearing randomly. Each witness sees people who were significant to them personally. Family members, close friends, people they had strong emotional connections to. They drove through Prague's old city center as the sun began to set. The cemetery was located on the outskirts of town, surrounded by newer residential developments. It would have been a peaceful place under normal circumstances. Local Bishop Kohler is meeting us at the cemetery gates, Sophia said. He's bringing holy water and blessed salt, but he still thinks we're investigating vandalism. Better that way. If he knew what we were really dealing with, he might panic and make mistakes. They parked outside the cemetery gates just as a black sedan pulled up beside them. Bishop Kohler emerged from the passenger seat, a thin man in his 60s with graying hair and kind eyes. He was accompanied by a younger priest who carried a leather satchel. Agents Benedetti and Martinelli, the bishop said, shaking their hands. I must say, this is quite unusual. In 30 years of service, I've never seen anything like this. Vandalism cases can be very complex, Marco replied. Sometimes they involve religious or cultural motivations that require special investigation. The bishop unlocked the cemetery gates and led them inside. The grounds were well maintained, with gravel paths winding between neat rows of headstones. In the fading daylight, it looked like any other cemetery. Peaceful, respectful, final. But Marco could see the disturbed graves immediately. Dark patches of earth marked where the ground had been excavated and left open. Personal items glinted on several headstones, catching the last rays of sunlight. The first incidents were reported here, Bishop Kohler said, pointing to a section near the old stone chapel. 5 graves in total, all of them people who died within the past 10 years. Marco knelt beside one of the empty graves and examined the soil patterns. The earth had definitely been pushed up from below, but the hole itself was perfectly shaped, too perfect for random digging. "Has anyone checked the other sections of the cemetery?" Sophia asked. "The groundskeepers do a full inspection every morning," the bishop replied. "No other graves have been disturbed, though there have been reports of unusual activity." "What kind of activity?" "People have reported hearing conversations at night. Quiet voices having normal discussions like old friends catching up. But when security checks, they find no one." Marco stood up and brushed soil from his hands. "We'll need to examine all the disturbed graves and document everything we find. This kind of investigation can take several hours. Of course, Father Dominic and I will wait in the chapel if you need anything." After the bishop and his assistant retreated to the chapel, Marco and Sophia got to work. They photographed each empty grave from multiple angles, measured the dimensions, and carefully cataloged the personal items left on the headstones. The work was routine, but Marco felt increasingly uneasy as full darkness fell over the cemetery. Not because of any supernatural dread. The rules had trained him to recognize and ignore those feelings. Instead, he was troubled by the methodical nature of what they were seeing. "This isn't random," he said to Sophia as they finished examining the 5th grave. "Look at the pattern." Sophia consulted her notes. All the deceased were between the ages of 25 and 65 when they died. All of them died of natural causes or accidents, no suicides, no murders, and all of them had close family or friends still living in the area. "Someone's selecting specific targets," Marco agreed. "But why these particular graves? And why now?" That's when they heard the voices. Quiet conversation, just as the bishop had described. 2 people talking casually about everyday things, the weather, local news, shared memories. The voices were coming from the direction of the newer section of the cemetery, beyond the area where the graves had been disturbed. Marco and Sophia exchanged glances. Sophia pulled out her blessed water and silver cross. Marco checked his watch. 9:47 p.m. "Rule 4, Sophia whispered. "If someone calls your name 3 times, leave immediately." "They're not calling our names," Marco replied. "They're just talking. We investigate." They moved carefully along the gravel path toward the source of the voices. The conversation became clearer as they got closer. A man and woman discussing a television program they had both enjoyed, laughing quietly at shared jokes. Marco recognized the voices from Pavel's description. The tone was warm, friendly, completely normal. If he had heard this conversation anywhere else, he would have assumed it was 2 neighbors chatting over a fence. But they were in a cemetery at night, and the voices were coming from an area where no living people should be. Sophia pointed ahead. 2 figures were sitting on a stone bench near a large memorial monument. They looked like an ordinary middle-aged couple enjoying an evening walk. The man wore a dark suit that might have been 20 years old. The woman had on a simple dress and cardigan. Both of them had soil in their hair. Marco approached slowly, his hand on the silver cross in his jacket pocket. The couple looked up as he and Sophia drew near, and their faces lit up with genuine pleasure. "Oh, hello," the woman said. "Are you visiting someone?" "It's such a lovely evening for a walk through the grounds." Her voice was exactly what Marco would expect from a kind grandmother. Warm, welcoming, completely sincere. but her dress was stained with cemetery dirt and her shoes were caked with earth. "We're conducting an investigation," Sophia said carefully. "May I ask your names?" "I'm Elena Novikova," the woman replied. "And this is my friend Dominic. We were just enjoying the peaceful atmosphere here. It's so quiet at night." Marco felt his pulse quicken. These were two of the names from Pavel's witness statement, his dead wife and his dead brother. "Elena," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Pavel has been looking for you. He's very worried." Elena's expression brightened. "Pavel? My dear Pavel. Yes, we saw him a few nights ago. We invited him to come stay with us, but he seemed frightened. I don't understand why. We're very happy where we are now." "Where are you staying?" Sophia asked. Dominic gestured toward the ground beneath their feet. "Just below. There's plenty of room and it's very comfortable. Warm and quiet with good company. Many of our friends are there. We'd love to show you," Elena added. "If you'd like to visit, just for a little while. You seem like nice people, and visitors are always welcome." Marco's training kicked in. Rule 3. Do not touch anything that has been underground. Rule 4. If someone calls your name 3 times, leave immediately. They hadn't called his name yet, but every instinct told him this conversation was heading toward an invitation he couldn't accept. "That's very kind," he said, "but we have work to finish here first." "Of course," Elena said. "Work is important, but when you're done, you're welcome to join us. There are no schedules or deadlines down there. Just time to spend with people you care about." Sophia stepped back slightly. "We should return to our investigation." Dominic nodded understandingly. "Certainly, but if you change your minds, we'll be here. We're always here now." As Marco and Sophia walked away, Elena called after them. "Marco." "Sophia? If you decide you'd like to visit, just call our names 3 times. We'll come back and show you the way." Marco froze. Elena had used their names they hadn't given her. "Marco," Elena's voice came again, more insistent now. "Sophia, you both seem so tired. Wouldn't you like to rest?" That was twice. "Run," Sophia whispered. They sprinted toward the cemetery gates, their footsteps echoing off the headstones. Behind them, Elena's voice called out one more time. "Marco." "Sophia, please don't leave. We have so much to show you." 3 times. They reached the rental car and drove away without looking back. Neither of them spoke until they were safely back in the city center. "Hotel first," Marco said. "Then we call Cardinal Toretti and request immediate backup." "What about the rules?" Sophia asked. "We're supposed to handle resurrections within the team." "Those weren't resurrections," Marco replied. "They were something else entirely, and I don't think the standard rules are going to be enough." The hotel room phone rang at exactly midnight. Marco answered on the first ring, knowing it would be Cardinal Toretti calling from Rome. "Report!" The Cardinal's voice came through clearly despite the distance. "The situation is not what we expected," Marco said. Sophia sat on the opposite bed, cleaning her silver cross with a hotel towel. "The entities we encountered knew our names without introduction. They appeared completely human, but showed clear signs of recent burial." "You followed Rule 4? "Yes. We left immediately after the 3rd call." There was a pause. Marco could hear papers rustling in the background as Toretti consulted his files. "Agent Benedetti, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need a precise answer. Did these entities threaten you in any way?" Marco considered carefully. "No, sir. They were polite, friendly, and inviting. They offered to show us where they were staying underground. Their behavior was more concerning than any direct threat." "Describe their physical appearance." "Normal human appearance, but with soil in their hair and dirt-stained clothing. They moved naturally, spoke naturally, showed genuine emotion. If not for the burial evidence, we would have assumed they were living people." More paper rustling. "Agent Martinelli, are you listening?" "Yes, Cardinal. Sophia replied. I'm sending Father Castellano and Agent Rivera on the next flight. They'll arrive tomorrow morning with specialized equipment. Until then, you are not to return to the cemetery under any circumstances. What kind of specialized equipment? Marco asked. Equipment for dealing with voluntary possessions. Marco felt his stomach tighten. Voluntary possession was one of the rarest and most dangerous situations the Black Archive encountered. Unlike forced demonic possession, where entities invaded unwilling hosts, voluntary possession occurred when people actively invited spiritual beings to inhabit their bodies. Sir, the witnesses described seeing deceased relatives and friends. Are you suggesting these people volunteered to be possessed? I'm suggesting that something is offering the living a choice, Toretti replied. And based on your report, some of them are accepting. The question is, what happens to the people who accept the invitation? After ending the call, Marco and Sophia spent the rest of the night reviewing their case files and preparing for the morning mission. Father Castellano was the Black Archive's specialist in voluntary possession cases, and Agent Rivera was an expert in underground spiritual phenomena. They met at Prague Airport at 7 a.m. Father Castellano was a compact man in his 50s with intense dark eyes and calloused hands. Agent Rivera was younger, perhaps 30, with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen things that most people couldn't imagine. Briefing, Castellano said without preamble as they walked to the rental car. Marco summarized the previous night's encounter while Rivera took notes. Castellano listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking for clarification on specific details. The invitation pattern is consistent with historical voluntary possession cases, Castellano said when Marco finished. The entities present themselves as deceased loved ones to lower psychological resistance. They offer comfort, companionship, and freedom from earthly concerns. What do they actually want? Sophia asked. Bodies, Rivera replied bluntly. Living bodies to inhabit and control. But they need the host to agree willingly, which is why they use emotional manipulation. And the people who accept? Their consciousness gets displaced while the entity takes over. Eventually, the original personality disappears entirely. They drove back to the cemetery in daylight. The disturbed graves looked even more obvious in the morning sun, dark scars across the otherwise peaceful grounds. Bishop Kohler was waiting for them at the gates with his assistant, Father Dominic. Any developments overnight? Marco asked. 2 more graves were opened, the bishop replied. And we received a call from the police. 3 people are missing from the surrounding neighborhood. Rivera pulled out his notebook. All people who had relatives buried here? Yes. A widow named Mrs. Kratochvilova, whose husband died last year. A young man named Peter Svoboda, whose mother is buried in the old section. And an elderly gentleman named Mr. Horak, whose parents and wife are all interred here. Marco exchanged glances with Sophia. The pattern was expanding exactly as they had feared. We need to examine the newly opened graves, Castellano said. And we need to do it before nightfall. They spent the morning documenting the additional grave sites. The excavation patterns were identical to the others. Perfect holes dug from below, with personal belongings arranged carefully on the headstones above. But Rivera found something else. Hidden among the memorial flowers on one headstone, he discovered a handwritten note. Pavel, Marco read aloud, we're waiting for you in the warm place below. Your friends miss you, and there's room for everyone. When you're ready, come to the cemetery at night and call for Elena 3 times. She'll show you the way down. Your loving family. They're actively recruiting, Sophia said. And they know Pavel is still alive and free, Rivera added, which means they're monitoring the situation above ground. Castellano knelt beside one of the empty graves and began pulling equipment from his bag. He withdrew what looked like a small electronic device with multiple sensors attached. Spiritual activity detector, he explained. If there are entities moving between underground spaces and the surface, This will pick up the energy signatures. He placed the device at the edge of the grave and activated it. Immediately, a series of red lights began flashing across its display. "High activity," Castellano said grimly. "Whatever's down there is very much alive and very active." "Can we determine how many entities?" Marco asked. "At least 15 distinct signatures, possibly more." Castellano studied the readouts, and they're all concentrated in a space directly beneath this section of the cemetery. Rivera consulted his maps. According to the city records, there are no tunnels or underground structures in this area. The cemetery was built on solid ground with proper drainage. "They're not using existing tunnels," Castellano replied. "They're creating their own space." As afternoon turned to evening, they developed their plan. The missing neighborhood residents would likely return to the cemetery after dark, drawn by the same invitations that had brought Elena and Dominic to the surface. When they arrived, the team would intervene before the voluntary possession process could be completed. "The key is timing," Castellano explained. "Once someone accepts the invitation and goes underground, retrieval becomes much more difficult. We need to intercept them during the transition." "What about our rules?" Sophia asked. "Are they still applicable?" Castellano consulted his own card, a different set of guidelines specific to voluntary possession cases. "Modified rules," he said. "Rule 1 remains the same, never go alone. Rule 2, carry blessed items, but add consecrated salt and iron. Rule 3, do not enter any underground spaces, even if invited. Rule 4, if any entity offers you a choice or invitation, refuse immediately and leave. Rule 5, anyone who shows signs of voluntary possession must be separated from the entities by dawn." At sunset, they positioned themselves around the cemetery perimeter. Marco and Sofia took the main entrance, while Castellano and Rivera covered the back sections where the new graves had been opened. The missing residents began arriving just after full darkness fell. Mrs. Kratochvilova came first, walking slowly through the cemetery gates with a bouquet of flowers. She moved with purpose, heading directly toward her husband's grave site. Marco watched through binoculars as she knelt beside the headstone and began speaking quietly. Within minutes, a figure emerged from the ground near the grave. Even from a distance, Marco could see that it was a middle-aged man in an old-fashioned suit, presumably Mr. Kratochvilova, risen from his burial site. The reunion was tender. The woman embraced the figure, and they spoke together for several minutes. Then the man gestured toward the ground, as if explaining something. Mrs. Kratochvilova nodded and took his hand. "They're about to go underground," Marco whispered into his radio. "Moving to intercept," Castellano's voice came back. But before the team could intervene, 2 more missing residents appeared. Peter Svoboda and Mr. Horak approached from different directions, both walking with the same purposeful stride as Mrs. Kratochvilova. Each was met by figures rising from grave sites, a woman in her 60s for Peter, and an elderly couple for Mr. Horak. The greetings were emotional but brief. Within minutes, all 3 groups were preparing to descend underground. "Too many targets," Rivera's voice crackled over the radio. "We can't reach all of them in time." That's when Marco made his decision. "Change of plan. We let them go down, then we seal the entrances." "That violates Rule 3, Sophia protested. "Rule 3 says we don't enter underground spaces," Marco replied. "It doesn't say we can't prevent others from using them." The team regrouped near the central chapel as the 3 groups of living and dead disappeared into the earth. Castellano began unpacking his specialized equipment: bags of consecrated salt, iron stakes, and bottles of holy water blessed by 3 different cardinals. "The theory is simple," he explained as they worked. "Voluntary possession requires ongoing connection between the entities and their underground source. If we can sever that connection, the possessions will fail and the entities will be forced back to their proper resting state." They moved systematically through the cemetery, pouring lines of consecrated salt around each disturbed gravesite. Rivera drove iron stakes into the ground at specific intervals, creating a geometric pattern that would contain spiritual energy. The work took 2 hours. By the time they finished, they had created a sealed barrier around the entire section where the grave disturbances had occurred. "Now we wait," Castellano said. The reaction was immediate. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate, and they could hear muffled voices coming from below. Not the friendly conversation they had encountered the previous night, but urgent, distressed calling. "Marco! Sophia!" Elena's voice rose from the earth. "Please help us! Something is wrong down here!" "They're trying to break the containment," Rivera warned. "The entities will use every emotional manipulation they can." "Help us!" Mrs. Kratochvilova's voice joined Elena's. "We're trapped! Please remove the salt!" Marco steeled himself against the pleas. These weren't the real people anymore. They were entities using stolen voices to try to break free. The calling continued for nearly an hour, growing more desperate as the night progressed. But gradually, the voices began to fade. The ground stopped vibrating. The cemetery fell silent. As dawn approached, they heard different sounds from underground. Peaceful sighs, whispered prayers, and finally, silence. "It's finished," Castellano said, checking his spiritual activity detector. "All readings are back to normal." They waited until full daylight before removing the salt barriers and checking the grave sites. Every hole had been filled in from below, with the earth neatly packed and leveled. The personal belongings were gone from the headstones. Bishop Kohler arrived as they were packing their equipment. "The missing residents," he said. "They were found this morning, safe in their homes. None of them remember leaving last night, but they all reported having wonderful dreams about reuniting with deceased loved ones." Marco felt a wave of relief. The voluntary possession process had been interrupted before it could become permanent. "What about the groundskeeper, Pavel?" Sophia asked. "He's recovered completely. The medical staff says it was just exhaustion and stress. He's requested a transfer to a different parish, but otherwise he seems fine." As they drove back to Prague Airport, Rivera explained what had happened underground. The entities were using the deceased bodies as anchors to maintain their connection to our world. When we contained the cemetery, they lost that connection and were forced to release their victims. The missing residents were returned to the surface automatically. "And the entities themselves?" Marco asked. "Back where they belong," Castellano replied. "Whatever realm they came from originally. The consecrated barriers will prevent them from returning through this location." "Will they try again elsewhere?" "Possibly, but now we know their methods and how to counter them. The Black Archive will issue updated protocols to all field teams." On the flight back to Rome, Marco completed his final report. The case would be classified and filed in the deepest levels of the archive, alongside thousands of other incidents that the world above would never learn about. 3 days later, he was back at his desk in the underground facility, reviewing photographs from a new case in Argentina. The coffee was fresh this time, and the work continued. But he kept the modified rules card in his jacket pocket, just in case. In his experience, the things that crawled out of the earth rarely stayed buried forever. The important thing was being ready when they tried again.